Welcome to the Produce on Purpose podcast, where we experience life being the real you. I'm your host, Randy Adkins Jr. I'm an author, teacher, speaker, preacher, lifelong learner. And today we are going to have a wonderful conversation with Leroy Slanzi. Leroy Slanzi is an experienced educator with a remarkable 25-year career in education. As an author, he penned the influential book, Emotional Schools, delving into the importance of emotional intelligence and mental health in the education system. Leroy also excels as a facilitator of professional development sessions. He has also been on numerous podcasts and is sought after for his work that helps parents, teachers, and schools through the chaos life brings. Leroy, welcome to the Produce on Purpose podcast. How are you today?
I am great, Randy. Thanks for having me today, my friend.
Well, thank you for coming on and being a part of the Produce on Purpose podcast. We would love to learn a little bit about your journey and how you ended up where you are and potentially what you may share with us. So give the audience a little bit about Leroy.
Sure. Well, I grew up in a very small town in rural British Columbia, Canada, which was pretty awesome, I think. Not much of a city guy. I grew up just, outside playing and interacting and with nature and friends. And I sort of migrated into just being a natural leader, I guess. I was that kid who was organizing the street hockey games and hide and seek. And, my friends always leaned on me in that regard. And I sort of just grew into that as I got older. And, in my late teens, I became a lifeguard, swim instructor, and went to college and became a teacher. And, from there, as a teacher, I had a dream of teaching grade 5, 6. Never happened. I ended up in a class with vulnerable students, at-risk kids, and I fell in love. And next thing I know, I did a master's in special ed and moved on to being an administrator, vice principal, in all three levels. So I've been an administrator in elementary, middle, and secondary school. And that's where I sort of developed my passion for, vulnerable learners and kids who struggle with mental health. And then I became a dad. I have 2 kids. I have a son who's 18, daughter who's 16. Son's off to his first year in college this year. And 25 years later, here I am trying to change the world.
One person at a time, one message at a time, we get to change the world as we share our message. Leroy, I've excited because we did have a call before, and I looked up a little bit. And emotional intelligence. First of all, I want to ask you, based on your background now that you've gone through, you've had students, you've went into education, you've talked about it, you have a book about it. What is your definition of emotional intelligence?
Well, I think the biggest thing with emotional intelligence revolves around a person's ego and their ability to check that ego, because we all have an ego, and it interferes with our lives in good and bad ways. But if we can check that ego and truly understand that there's other people in the room, and so that means you have to be personally aware of how you're feeling, personally aware of what your triggers are, personally aware of what those things are that kind of drive you. But you also have to be socially aware. You have to be aware of how you're affecting other people or how other people are affecting you. And truly understanding that, people come with baggage. And, as great as life may be for some people, I don't think there's a person alive who grew up in utopia without some trials and tribulations, right? And I think, when you're self-aware and you're socially aware, you can understand that there's an emotional piece that's going to come into any conversation or any workplace that you're at. Excuse me. And, and for kids, it's getting harder and harder to not recognize that they're coming in with some emotional baggage that revolve around their ability to cope. And so it's really about being, trauma informed. It's about being able to have some introspection and being able to just understand that everyone is different and brings something to the table. And if you can do that, and then you throw in those competencies around being able to communicate and critically think, and being creative, and you throw that in with an emotional understanding, Bob's your uncle, and things will go well when you're working with people or kids and whatnot. So that's my belief about emotional intelligence, and it's when you can do that, you can form relationships. You learn how to be a servant. It's easier to structure things because people will just get on board with somebody who understands holistically what it means to function in the world.
I really appreciate that you were having this conversation with younger students because I really don't feel like I was exposed to emotional intelligence until later. Like, I'm in on the job and I'm now understanding what emotional intelligence is, and potentially I may have picked up some things along the way. However, the idea of teaching that to students to be aware is wonderful, because I think then they actually have the opportunity to continue to build that skill set over time and over the years. My question is that now that you have seen it, you've seen it in
Mm-hmm.
students, and now we have adults as well. Is it the same approach for students that you would do for an adult? And what would be the initial approach to making sure someone is in that space that understands the emotions are a play a part in what we do?
Yeah, I think I'll start with kids if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I can just think of, yesterday was Friday, and here in Canada it's minus 11 degrees Celsius outside, so it's cold, snows here, and it's dark at 4:30, and kids are struggling with their sleep patterns and whatnot. And I've got a whack of kids in kindergarten and grade 1, grade 2 who truly struggle with how they're feeling and understanding their feelings. So early on, you start with getting them to understand and being able to label what they're feeling. So if they're feeling frustrated, I want them to say I'm frustrated, or if they're feeling sad, I want them to say I'm sad, or if I'm super happy, we want them to say that they're experiencing joy. So once they can truly identify those feelings, then we talk about being able to manage those feelings. And of course, I'm using simpler language than I'm using with you, because I'm not going to talk to a great kid who's 5 years old about managing emotions. It's going to be about feelings. And what you do is you relate those feelings to deep breaths, and you relate those feelings to understanding that if you can take deep breaths, and you can engage that diaphragmatic breathing, it affects your brain. And so we teach brain science to kids in kindergarten. And of course, we differentiate it so it's a much simpler language. And so, I'll have kids in kindergarten, grade 1, 2, who are dysregulated, who are emotional, and even, they may not be able to calm themselves, and they need that co-regulation piece. But I hear them talking the talk right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so the goal is by the time they're in end of grade 2, grade 3, they're not just talking the talk, they're walking the walk, in the sense, I'm feeling angry, I'm going to take some deep breaths, and I'm going to work this conflict out with my buddy or my teacher.
Right.
And that's what we do. And so in schools that and I've been in so many schools that I incorporate this method. I rarely have a lot of behavioral issues with kids from grade 4 and up. I mean, it happens, and I can't say it doesn't, but there's less spastic, spontaneous, combustible behavior that sets classrooms off, because we start very early, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I do a lot of that work when I teach it. I do it through structured play, right? So, because there's no better way to teach a kid than having them enjoy, you know, the camaraderie that comes when you play a game.
Mm-hmm.
And I literally will make the game easy to start, and then I make it harder as it goes. So I've kind of poked the bear because I'm trying to pull those emotions out, so that way I can proactively teach them to soothe in the moment. And I wrote the second book I wrote is a breathing strategies book. It's got 50 fun breathing strategies for parents and teachers, and really it's just a repetitive way of taking deep breaths, and I call it hot chocolate breathing, rocket ship breathing, bumblebee breathing, and kids love taking a deep breath and going because they think they're bumbling. So we start that very early, and then as they get older, they just learn to take deep breaths, and so that's how we develop those mindful strategies early,
Mm-hmm.
and it kind of develops through. And when I was in a high school, and then slowly progress up to adults, kids in a high school are more aware of how they're feeling emotionally, and whether or not drugs or alcohol have come into play for kids, because that adds a different element to it. And whether or not their relationship with their parents is sound or not, or if they're playing sports or if they're involved in a club, um, you know, but they understand when they struggle. So as a principal of a high school, the conversations I have are more on an intellectual. We're not doing bumblebee breathing, but you talk about being mindful. We talk about meditation. I don't teach it, but we talk about the practice of how soothing your body can soothe your mind, so you can think and you can say the right thing instead of the wrong thing, or your actions will reflect that.
Mm-hmm.
And it really had a tremendous impact actually on teenagers who were in those AP classes like chemistry and math, because there's a lot of test anxiety and whatnot, because they're engaging with that. And then the kids that struggle with addiction, for those kids, it's a matter of being able to say no, and being able to
Mm-hmm.
take deep breaths and step back and going, dude, no, right? And so you kind of get to them, and you hope that the elementary schools have done some of that work around that emotional intelligence piece, so it's not as hard. Unfortunately, I've had to go into high schools where there's been um, no previous experience with that, so you kind of have to start from scratch and train the teachers. And so that brings me to the whole adult piece. And
Right.
I find with adults, and I had a conversation with a parent yesterday, and she was calling because she thought her kid was being bullied, and I I have a hard time with parents accusing kids of bullying when they're 6, because it's all emotional, right?
Right.
When bullying typically is when a kid is astutely aware they're trying to hurt somebody's feelings or hurt them physically, and when a kid is 6, they're emotional and they're playing tag, and they may hit somebody harder, or you're stupid or something like that. But what I had to do to get her to understand the dynamic of the kids is I had to active listen. I had to
Mm-hmm.
hear her out. Um, God, it went on for, the conversation was a long conversation, and it was a pleasant conversation. And you find out that she's dealing with whatever illness she may be dealing with, which takes away from what's happening with her kids. And then you just sort of, as you active listen and you acknowledge the trauma, and that's what I talked about earlier with really understanding the people in the room, you find your spots, those teachable moments when you're having those conversations with parents where you can slide that information in form, and they're usually quite receptive, unless they're ignorant, because there are obviously adults that we know out there that are quite ignorant and don't want to hear anything revolving around other people, just what's going on in their home. But for the most part, it's that active listening piece, it's that communication piece, and being aware that they're bringing something to the table
Mm-hmm.
that may be difficult. And here in Canada, one of the things that we deal with is, I'm actually moved out of the public system into an Indigenous school. So I work on an Indian reservation, and here are the colonizers took our Indigenous kids and put them into residential schools, committed genocide, all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of generational trauma that we deal with here, and so I'm always very mindful when I talk to an Indigenous person about their historical experience, and I know people will often say, oh, they should get over it and whatnot. It's like, well, you got to understand, they may have been put in a residential school in 1940, 1950, the last residential school closed in 1980, right? So, but that trauma from being physically abused, sexually abused, whatever it was, goes on to their kids and then their kids, right? And so I think it was a really smart move on my part being able to shift to a school like that, because it's really helped me understand that trauma piece, and it's really honed my skills around developing emotional intelligence with parents. And to make a long story short, so I'm babbling here, it's truly about that active listening piece, understanding that people are coming in with trauma, and respecting that, right, and giving them the floor and finding your spots, right.
That's, of course, a whole lot. And I appreciate you taking the time to share, the approach for emotional intelligence from all the way from the elementary all the way up to an adult, and the areas where I think it sounds like emotional intelligence, you have to be able to label, sounds like the first step, regardless of who you are. That's something that you have to do. What are some of I know you talked a little bit about the technique of playing games with the younger children, but what do you also do to help people start to label? Because I know even as a man, sometimes the easy way to label is that I'm just angry. I'm angry, and I don't understand why, but I know I might have just been in a place where I was afraid, or I felt embarrassed, but I keep saying I'm angry. How do you help to those to find that way of being able to label the feelings that they're having?
Yeah, I think the biggest piece, particularly for men, as like we do have that one emotion, and we like to make it tough. We like to make it sound like, I'm angry, not I'm sad, not I feel shame or jealousy. And I think, what I try to do is I try to explain what it means to be vulnerable. And, even my 18-year-old son, I raised my son to, and he grew up an angry child. Like he grew up a kid who was quick to, blow. But we always had a lot of conversations, and I tried to teach him that it was okay to just let it out, right? And I think if you can truly understand and find a path to, getting men, women to understand that vulnerability makes you stronger, and you have to use those masculine words like strength and power, and and one of the things that I actually use that terminology with my kids at my school. It's like, are you making a strong decision or a weak decision? And that's not your muscle strength, that's your mental strength.
Right.
And so we teach that early, and those messages go from our kids to our parents. Not to mention you post that stuff on social media and whatnot, but using that terminology allows you to take people from power, strength, anger to vulnerability, which, and if you can get people to truly understand what it means to be vulnerable, it's easier for them to say, God, I feel shameful. I feel some shame for my actions.
Right.
I was jealous. I was jealous in that moment. Or, you know what? I was acting like a clown. I was being an idiot. I thought I was being funny, and I think, as you move people towards being comfortable with being vulnerable, then you open that window to more emotions. But it takes strength for a man to be vulnerable, and it's hard. It's really hard. I did a workshop on Friday with a school that I, 300-400 kilometers away, and I was telling the story of my daughter, how she's recently been diagnosed with a learning disability, and I started to cry, and I came out of nowhere because I'm not a crier, and I was like, oh shit, this is. And in the moment, I was like, okay, you're in instant trigger, Leroy, you're being weak, Leroy. This is, and I, and then I had to catch myself. I'm like, hey, take some deep breaths. Like, no, you're just being vulnerable. And I paused, and I said to the teacher, because I was teaching about being mindful, I said, I just need to take a few minutes. I just need to take some deep breaths. And I said, this is hitting home. And, it was amazing the response you get showing strength in acknowledging something hurt your heart, right? And that's the key, I think, is that vulnerability piece.
And there's a freedom there when you allow the labeling to occur. You actually become vulnerable in situations. I I I think the thing that I'm thinking about now is typically to grow into those spaces. You said you got to help people to become vulnerable. Usually, you need safe spaces for that, because typically the reason why it hasn't been addressed yet is because maybe the spaces that a particular person was in, they didn't have the safe space to express that particular feeling without being chastised, put down, or whatever, having additional trauma put on them. How do you create those safe spaces in education or even in your home to make sure that vulnerability is something that is celebrated instead of something that somebody is going to take and use against you?
Yeah, and it's interesting because when you look at school dynamics, like I said, I was a principal of an elementary school, middle school, high school, and several times each, right? And the dynamic between an elementary school, which is predominantly female, most elementary teachers, I would say every school I've worked in, 90% of the staff is female. And then you get to high school and you start seeing this shift where the staff now becomes 50% male, 50% female. And that's where the dynamic becomes difficult because women are capable of being more vulnerable and sharing. However, women are also capable of being more malicious towards each other, where that mean girl thing kind of comes out, and so you have to really talk about, when you have staff meetings and you're working with teachers in elementary school about, when we leave the room, whatever we've done in here stays in the room, because women will have this habit of using it, right? But when you're in the moment and you're in a staff meeting, you're very open, very, emotional and doing that. It's what they do after. And then when you get into a high school and you're working with the staff with more men, you're in a staff meeting and they clam up. They don't want to be that guy, right? And so, but then afterwards they leave the meeting. They have a little more respect for those that do share. I find men don't do the talking behind the back, and they don't do those things. And I don't want to paint, all women and all men with the same brush, but that's what I've seen in my career when it comes to the dynamic of genders in terms of having those safe spaces. And the real key is for myself or our leader of the school to be vulnerable. The moment I can stand up there as the school leader and show some vulnerability, like I mentioned at that workshop, how I, shed some tears. If you can show vulnerability to other men, in the same breath they watch you in a meeting with an angry parent, put your foot down and show some, some strength with dealing with somebody who's just off their keister, but yet you can turn around and cry the next moment. There's a level of respect that's created. And so you have to lead by example. You have to model that behavior. And, once you establish that, teachers are a lot like kids. I think any business you're in, people, when they see a strong leader, the employees will emulate their leader. And, and that's how you create those spaces, because you make them safe yourself. If you are a leader and you clam up and you don't have those conversations that make you vulnerable, well, your staff's not going to either. There's not going to be any trust there, right? So you have to have some skin in the game, so to speak, right?
And I've had conversations with many, and sometimes the expression of emotions can be taken as something that is more of not in control, spontaneous. But what you're talking about is the expression of emotion and then being aware and being able to know I need to take a breath. How do we get that? And from a perspective, you have talked about the strength that comes from that expression of emotion in those vulnerable moments. How can you get someone to begin to see that? Is it just consistently practicing that, or how do you get there?
Well, Randy, it's interesting you bring that up. So I'm going to talk about school districts and government policy. So, for example, one of the things when I do these workshops is, teachers, the first thing they complain about is student behavior. They complain that it's hard. And teachers, as you know, because you're in the United States, teachers are leaving the profession. They'll get in for 2 years and they're gone, or they're at the apex of their career and they just don't want to finish. And then, not to mention, in the States, they don't pay teachers very well either, right? And so it's so interesting because every teacher knows that they can't teach math, they can't teach literacy if their kids are dysregulated, right? Yet, time and time again, and they're typically male leaders in a district leadership role. We're starting to see more women in roles of superintendencies and stuff like that. But typically what you see is these men who don't want to, you know, take on the task of social emotional learning. And what they'll do is we're going to do a professional development on assessment. We're going to do a professional development on, on math concepts. And and we're living in this generation where kids are not what they were when you and I grew up, and the grit and the perseverance is not there. And so that's the hard part that I find. It's funny. I did a podcast last night with a doctor from Florida, and he said, "Well, how do you get your message out? How do you get the emotional intelligence piece out?" And I said, I'm the greatest thing since sliced bread that nobody knows about, because sometimes you can't break down those barriers. I will reach out to superintendents and I will reach out to districts, and they ignore me. There's no, so when I do get, speaking gigs or professional development gigs, it comes from the trenches. It comes from people who are in the day-to-day calling, and then they have to go and convince, typically a male principal who has an ego. They have to convince them that, hey, we need this because our behavior is out of control in our school. And administrators typically don't want to hear it, because then they're admitting if behavior is out of control in their school, they have to admit that their school's not functioning as well as it should. And so, I'm kind of picking on, on these men, but at the end of the day, very early in this interview, I talked about checking your ego at the door. It's all about ego. And I think that's the hardest part, is that we need the people who aren't in the trenches to truly understand that emotional intelligence leads to kids being better at reading, better at mathematics, better at critical thinking, better at creative thinking. And it's like they put the cart before the horse. It's like, I'm going to take you teachers, I'm going to teach you how to assess. It's like, well, you can't get to the assessment if the kids aren't ready to learn basic addition or subtraction or how to write their name. And so yeah. I think that's the biggest challenge. And, the more teachers struggle with behavior, and what I'm noticing is that I'm starting to get more and more calls around coming in to work with teachers in schools around developing programs with social emotional learning, because they can't teach anymore because you're putting out fires all day. And so right. You got to kind of chip away at that male hierarchy that where people who are in these positions of power that haven't been in the trenches in years, and they read an article about something and they're not listening to the people who are ready to quit, right? So it's we're getting in there, but it's difficult. It's like this. It's like being on a podcast with a guy like you, yeah. and you and I having this conversation and hoping, if you're listening, Mr. Leader out there who's not thinking about emotional intelligence, listen to Randy and I. This is where we make the difference, right? And so we chip away, my friend. We chip away.
And that's what it is, right? We begin to have those conversations. Sounds like there's some more success right now coming from the ground up, and seeing some wins within the classrooms, and then having those particular teachers become champions and further it into hopefully districts and to our educational system. I have a piece here that says you have this concept called a pathway. Is this similar? And when we talk about having a pathway through mental health that you talk about in your books, can you elaborate what the pathway entails and how that is implemented in schools?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, ironically, I'm releasing my third book. I'm going to do a big announcement tonight or tomorrow, and it's on leadership. And that pathway is all about building a capacity in your school. So whenever you want, and I'll talk literacy for a second. So right now, about 20 years ago, we used to teach phonics, letter sound recognition, to learn how to read, right? So that way kids could break down words and they can persevere and then it switched to this notion where we're going to just do whole language, where we're going to get kids to look at the whole word. They're going to memorize that word. We're going to create these sight words. And what we saw is a decline in literacy rates because kids couldn't persevere through these words. So there's been a big shift in the educational system all over the world, going back to this science of reading, which is phonics based, sound based, speech language pathology based. But to implement it, you have to have a pathway. You can't just say, we're going to do this, go. Right. And so it's the same thing with social emotional learning. You have to create the structure in your school. You have to support the instructional pedagogy, the growth that you need the teachers to have. Everyone needs to know what their jobs are. And so it's part of the reason why I wrote this book, is it supplements the emotional schools book, because it actually is a guide for leadership to say, okay, this is what I need to do to make sure literacy thrives, numeracy thrives, social emotional learning thrives. And it's ironic because the biggest thing in leadership, if you want people to move forward, is that relationship leadership piece and that servant leadership piece. If you can get people to buy in and trust, then when you do organize the school and structure it, you can build that capacity and build these programs into place, which gives you the pathway to success. And that's that's what I do workshops on. That's what I try to do with teachers, even within their own classrooms, building that pathway to success as an individual. I mean, holistically, you want schools and classrooms to not work in silos. You want them to work together. But ultimately, you've got to lay it out, and you've got to explain what roles and responsibilities are. And then you get to the point where everyone knows what their roles and responsibilities are. And then they start helping each other out. All of a sudden, when they see the principal with the mop bucket cleaning up because the custodian's busy somewhere else, or a teacher noticing the cook is scrambling to get the sandwiches made for lunch and they jump in the kitchen on their prep block, you start seeing this community being built. And that's the pathway, is you create this collective capacity through leadership, through structure, through organization. The biggest thing is communication. That is the biggest thing. If you can't communicate your agenda or communicate timely, you're going to end up in a toxic environment, right? So you just got to set that path forward, and that's what I talk about emotional schools in my latest book. I really lay it out so that schools can actually move forward. Again, the roadblock to that is how big of the ego you're faced with in the principal's office or the district office. If that ego is too big and they won't see it, then I would consider moving to a new school where you have a leader who's compassionate and wants to lead the right way.
It really does sound like, at least initially, you target teachers, you get classrooms involved, and what you're talking about, of course, if you can have a leader that can provide the whole pieces of what you're talking about from a pathway perspective, because we learn by modeling, we learn by seeing, and part of the culture, and I'll call that out because even in the corporate world, a lot of people ask me, and I'm like, well, how did you create a culture around a particular team? Well, it has to do with, you have some agreements that everyone has. Then from those agreements, we all show up with those same agreements consistently all the time, regardless of your position. You understand that, hey, I'm working in this particular role, and I will always do my part. But if I find that you need help, I'm gonna serve you. I'm gonna help you. I'm gonna do what I need to do. I think that is just awesome to hear, and we will also be just sharing a message of emotional intelligence being a key component of that to be able to move forward. Mm-hmm. So we are already coming to the end. I always feel like the time is so never long enough. What I'm going to ask is, I love to provide our audience with a few items on what they can do. So from your perspective, whether I'm a parent, maybe I'm someone that's just an adult, what are your thoughts, and what are the key pieces that you feel that someone can take and implement today? One or two items that you want to share and leave with our audience.
I think the biggest thing is, and I'm going to go to vulnerability, is I think that people need to truly understand that vulnerability is strength. And the moment people can understand that vulnerability is strength, it's going to allow them to open the doors for, parenting, for teaching, for whatever, wherever they work. If they can allow for that, then the emotional intelligence will grow. And, if you can't be vulnerable, that means your ego's in the way of you being, personally aware and being able to self-reflect. And it makes it difficult for you to see how other people are feeling and what trauma is going on for them. And so I think the key is to vulnerability, because it just opens the floodgates to developing emotional intelligence. So research it, understand it, and you'll be a better parent because of it. You'll be a better coworker, better teacher, better leader. It's the holy grail.
Well, thank you, Leroy, for taking the time to really explain this and share, especially from an educational perspective. How can my audience find you and find more information about your books and what you're doing today?
Yeah, they can find me at www.leroyslanzi.com, or they can email me at leroyslanzi@gmail.com. I'm also on YouTube. I'm hitting all the social media channels: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. I'm even on TikTok now, giving that a go. And it's just Leroy Slanzi. Somehow just Google Leroy Slanzi, and there's not many, Italians with the name Leroy. So you get the Leroy Slanzi, and there won't be many of us out there. So it's not like John Smith. So yeah, that's the way to do it.
Well, thank you, Leroy, for all that you shared today. I have taken some great information back from what you have talked about, and specifically vulnerability and the approaches. I've heard of some of the box breathing, breath work, and it sounds like you have a book on some of the different ways of being able to share that and communicate that. How communication is really key in making sure that we are creating these pathways in our schools, and hopefully you're creating them in your homes, creating them everywhere that you're going. That is something that you are sharing so that we can serve in a greater way. We can become more emotionally aware, self-aware of who we are, and of course, most of all, because we are all on this podcast, that we all learn to produce on purpose.